Actually, Dr. Juman, would it be okay if you stop sharing because Roxana's screen isn't coming up? Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our webinar. We will begin this webinar with a short introduction on Shifa Community Clinic and our guest speaker for today.
Hello and welcome to Shifa Community Clinic's Outreach webinar. This is Noor. Today's topic in the humanitarian economic crisis in Yemen. For those of you who do not know, Shifa Community Clinic is one of the UC Davis's 9 student-run clinics that provide health insurance and the underserved and uninsured population of Sacramento. Our clinic has a plethora of specialty clinics, including but not limited to dental clinic, women's health clinic, legal clinic. We see patients via telehealth appointments and in-person appointments every Sunday of the month. You can schedule an appointment with us by calling our clinic at 916-441-6008 between Monday and Thursday. Please leave your name, contact information, and reason for the visit. Our clinic is located at 419 V Street in Sacramento. You can access this information on our website at www.shifaclinic.org. Our guest speaker joining us today is Dr. Aisha Jaman. Dr. Jaman is the president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation and will be providing us with information on the humanitarian crisis, plans for aid relief, and health-related programs in development. I would like to thank Dr. Jaman for joining us today and give her the floor to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you all for inviting me to be part of your session today, especially on a very important topic like what's going on in Yemen. Yemen, unfortunately, has been going through some very severe humanitarian crisis. And I'll discuss a lot of it, but I think the most important piece for me is that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is actually man-made. And we can stop it if we decide, if the international community is serious about stopping what's going on in Yemen. The information I'm going to share are all from UN reports and Western media, specifically the UK and the US. And the reason I use these because the US and the UK are participants in the war and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And I'm using UN reports because I want to be as transparent and unbiased about what's going on as possible. So if we look at key figures, this is from an OSHA report that was published October 18. There are 24 million people in Yemen out of 30 who are in need of some assistance. about 14 million are in need of immediate assistance. There are about 4 million people in Yemen who are internally displaced. Yemen borders are closed. That's why people cannot leave Yemen. So with a lot of the wars that are happening in many places in the world, you see people migrating, and that's where they get attention. Yemen, unfortunately for the people there, because it's blockaded, a lot of people don't get to know about the suffering of the people there. So these are some very few statistics on the situation in Yemen. We know that about 80% of the population in Yemen lives in extreme poverty. Over 20 million people are food insecure. 10 million of them are at risk of famine. Over 1 million women and 2 million children have acute malnutrition. We have the highest COVID-19 fatality rate in the world. 25% is actually on the lower limit of fatality rate in Yemen. It's 29%. We also have the largest cholera outbreak with over 2.5 million suspected cholera cases in Yemen. And then, of course, multiple outbreaks, including dengue, diphtheria, polio. And Yemen was actually declared polio-free many years ago. And now we have polio back in Yemen. And of course, measles and severe acute respiratory infections outbreaks. And I'll discuss many of those. So as I said, famine in Yemen need not happen, meaning that it is actually man-made. Millions of people are on the brink of starvation. Yemen warring parties can save them. This is from also OCHA. It says Yemen, nearly 100,000 children are at risk of death and need urgent treatment. This is a report that came on the 27th of October, and it only is talking about the southern governorates in Yemen. So we have 100,000 children who are at risk of death because of malnutrition, and that's just in the southern governorates that represent 30% of the Yemeni population. Acute malnutrition rates among children under 5 are the highest ever recorded in any parts in these parts of Yemen. I also know from my work in Yemen that Hajja and Hodeidah, which are not counted in these statistics, have the highest malnutrition rates in Yemen. This is from Middle East Eye. It says Saudi-led naval blockade turns Yemen into a humanitarian disaster. This is Human Rights Watch. The Saudi coalition naval blockade has halted the flow of fuel that is needed to power hospital and water treatment plants. This was published in 2017. And the reason I wanted to share this, because I want to compare it to what's going on today. So this is Saudi-led coalition. This is again from Human Rights Watch. Saudi-led coalition blocking and impeding humanitarian access. And it says, and this was published last month, October 2020, it said, they stopped goods from entering Houthi-controlled seaports, restricted commercial imports, delayed and diverted fuel tankers, closed critical ports in the Red Sea, blocked fuel entry, and closed Sana'a International Airport since August 2016. Not enough people are talking about the blockade of Yemen. Everybody is talking about the airstrikes. I actually consider the blockade as the main reason we have a humanitarian crisis, because of the inability to bring things into Yemen. This is from ICRC. They updated it actually also, this month, and it's the same thing. It's just credible risk of famine. 2/3 of the people in Yemen have almost nothing to eat. That's over 20 million people. If we look at the commercial imports volumes, and this is through the UN system, in the Red Sea ports of Yemen, and that is Hodeidah, Salif, where about 90% that have the capacity to import 90% of what Yemen needs in metric tons between July 2016 to June 2020. That's the latest data they have. So you see the blue lines are food imports, and then the orange lines are fuel imports. And you can see we never, it fluctuates quite a bit. Fuel imports are actually quite low, and that means that the country doesn't have sovereignty over what gets into the country. And what happens when we have that is that the average cost of the minimum food basket just increases quite a bit. And this shows the increase over time for food. And in the blue line, it's in the Sana'a government. And in the brown one is the internationally recognized government. So even the areas under the internationally recognized government are suffering, and not just the Houthi-controlled areas. Fuel crisis, this is also from the UN, and it was published last month. It says fuel crisis increases food prices and continues to restrict the aid operations, because you need fuel for everything. You need it to transport goods, you need it for hospitals, you need it. A lot of hospitals had to actually reduce their hours, and many had to close. This is a list of the few ships that had been diverted from Hodeidah to Jeddah port. And as you can see, many of them had been there for a long time. The oldest was Mount Damas, and they was there for 185 days. After they receive a UN certification to get into Yemeni ports, they then get diverted. So if I look at the fuel imports into Yemen, you can see in the red line, a lot of it is below what Yemen needs. And in June 20th of this year, it basically is at 1%. What happens is when you do that, again, you get the average prices of the fuel, whether you're talking about diesel or petrol, increases in both the areas controlled by the Houthis or by the Hadi governments. This is an example of one of the ships that was held for 200 days by the time it was released. And actually it was released at the end of last month. It was stopped for 200 days. And the certificate of clearance is the UN system that says the fuel ship is clear and can enter into Yemen. So what happens when they are, held for that long? They have to pay fees because the shipping company loses a lot of money by having their ship stay. And so the Yemeni population will have to pay over $4 million in fees for the fuel on this ship because of the delay in its port, it's coming to Yemen. This is Jan Egeland. He is the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He's basically saying we need to reopen Yemen airports and sea routes to save lives. As people across the globe yearn to travel, the closure of airports is a matter of life and death for Yemeni people. We must apply political pressure and have them reopen despite the pandemic. A lot of people who need medical evacuation actually die because they're not able to fly out of Sana'a. So now I'm moving into the Saudi-led coalition airstrikes on Yemen. This is a group that is based in London, and they have decided that they're going to collate data on the airstrikes. This shows Saudi airstrikes on Yemen from 2015 to September 2020. And we see the airstrikes continue to happen for almost 6 years now. And that also civilian targets are among the ones that had been, the airstrikes had hit. We've had markets, we've had funerals, we've had weddings, we have hospitals. Many of them had been targeted by the airstrikes. This is just from September of 2020 to show you which areas had the highest airstrikes. You see Marib, Al Jawf, and Sada, and Al Bayda had a lot of airstrikes in September of this year. If we look at the air raids where we know what they hit, because sometimes we don't know what they hit, you see that 4 hit farms that led to 2 deaths. We see that vehicles and buses, 3 hit them with 8 deaths. We see that private businesses, 2 were hit and 5 deaths, and so forth. So a lot of civilian infrastructure in Yemen had been hit. Actually, there is a report that came out from Germany at the end of last month that said that targeting of bridges in Yemen was purposeful through an analysis they did. These are the Saudi-led air raids on civilians that I just mentioned. And as I said, one hit a water tank as well. If we look at the Yemen Health Facility functioning status by September 2020, we see that only 50% of the Yemen health systems are functioning. 35% are partial functioning and 15% are non-functional. And if you look at where the targets are of the airstrikes, you see most of them are in the northern and western parts of Yemen that are under the control of the Sana'a government. And then, as they say, when it rains, it pours. This summer, Yemen experienced torrential floods, also resulted in a lot of damage. This picture is from an assessment Yemen Relief did in Al-Luhayya, Hudaydah in August 2020. So in terms of the flooding between July and August, it affected Marib, Hajjah, Rayman, Mahwit, and Hudaydah. Dams overflowed, roads were damaged, a lot of the buildings were destroyed, especially in the old Sana'a city that is in UNESCO heritage site. By August, 731 were dead and 125 were injured. About 35,000 families were affected. By the first week of August, 17,000 families were affected. And August 5, UNHCR estimated 9,000 families were affected just in Hajjah and Hudaydah. And then by the end of it, it says that 300 people lost their homes, income, food supplies, and belonging due to the flooding in Yemen. These are just some statistics by areas, so I'll just pass over that. And this is just to show you a picture of the damage from the rain. This is Sana'a city. And this is very important because Sana'a is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's a UNESCO heritage site. And the torrential rain damaged many homes this year in Yemen. A lot of people don't understand why this year the damage was extensive. In my view, that damage was extensive this year because Sana'a had experienced very many airstrikes and large bombing that affected the buildings in the city. And because of the economic downfall, people were not able to maintain their buildings. So this was published in the Washington Post, and they interviewed Ayman Al-Hamdani. She's 55, and this is what she said. Well, in 2015, airstrikes killed her husband. In 2018, airstrike damaged the walls and roof of her home. In August 2020, water poured through the ceilings. Economic hardship, people cannot maintain or fix their homes. And now I'll talk about the impact of the conflict and the humanitarian crisis on outbreaks in Yemen. This is the distribution of acute watery diarrhea, cholera cases by governorates from week 1 to week 40, 2020 of this year. And the darker the color is, the harder hit the area is. And the focus on Hudaydah, as I said, Hudaydah is one that has also some of the largest rates of malnutrition. And you couple that with diarrhea, that makes it even worse for children and the population. This is the epi curve for the cholera from 2019 and 2020 for the same, until week 37 of this year. And so we are seeing some decline of cholera, and I'm hopeful that this will be, hopefully not affect as much the population. However, when we look at the number for the same time period, which is week 1 to week 40 in 2018, 19, and 20, we see that the number of suspected cases in 2020 is very similar to the number of cases in 2018, which is about 200,000 cases. This is a distribution of suspected dengue fever cases by governorate in Yemen. Again, you will see Hodeidah is one with the highest incidence of dengue fever. And this is the epi curve of dengue fever. So dengue is seasonal, and we see it more in the winter. So I hope that this coming winter, we don't see a spike in cases like we did last year. If we look at the number of cases for dengue fever, 2018, 19, and 2020, we see that in 2020 so far, we've had more than double the cases we saw in 2018 and 2019. This is an epi curve of diphtheria cases with case fatality rates. This is cumulative from week 1 2019 to week 41 in 2020. Again, you see the seasonal pattern of diphtheria. What is important to note here that Yemen had not had the diphtheria outbreaks since 1980. So again, Yemen gains in health indicators are being erased, and Yemen is losing 20 to 30 years of advances that they have had in the health sector. Again, if we look at the number of cases of diphtheria, this year we are up to 1,295 cases, very similar to 2019, and we'll see we're still, we may see more cases in the winter as well. This is epi curve for SARI, which is severe acute respiratory infections. And last winter, Yemen experienced a very large outbreak of SARI with a quite high fatality rate, actually. And I wrote a paper on that. And we see in week 23 of this year, the fatality rate is quite high. And this is probably because that is actually COVID-19, and it was coded as severe acute respiratory infections. Again, if we look at the cases, 2018, 19, and 2020, we see that the cases in 2020 are much higher than those in 2019. We have not, again, measles is another one. Unfortunately, measles outbreak started this year. And as you can see, there are quite a few number of measles cases. And measles is actually an indicator of war. So poor countries and countries that are experiencing war, we start seeing large outbreaks of measles because of the breakdown of the vaccination program. So if we look at the number of measles outbreak, there are about 3,532. What I want here to focus on is the number of districts that are experiencing measles. And there are 87 districts. Yemen has about 300 districts. So we're about 1/3 of the countries experiencing measles. And now I'll move into COVID-19. This is a tweet by ICRC, which is the International Red Cross. It basically said, "Dear rest of the world, are you afraid of losing your loved ones? Cannot move freely? Access to healthcare became a daily struggle? We understand you. This has been our 24/7 for years now. Solidarity from Yemen." So everything that we are experiencing here in a lot of countries, which is we cannot get out, we cannot travel, our economy has been affected because of COVID. Yemen has been experiencing that for almost 6 years now. So if we look up, this is as of October 19, the number of COVID cases in Yemen, the confirmed one are about 2,000 cases. We know for sure that there is underreporting. First of all, the northern governorates in Yemen, where 70% of the population is, they're not reporting COVID-19 cases. They are collecting the information, they're just not reporting it. And then we also know they don't have enough tests, kits to assess and identify people with COVID-19. But what is important in this slide is the case fatality rate, which is about 29%, the highest in the world. These are the number of cases over time, and cumulative, of course, you'd expect that there is an increase. And again, for fatality is about 1/3 of the cases are dying. If there is one governorate that has the best reporting in Yemen, it will be Hadramaut, and it's the dark green in this map. And again, you'll see out of the 956 confirmed cases that they tested, we have 1/3 of those dying, which is actually, I think that is representative of Yemen because the other ones are not reporting. This is just showing fatality rate and cases. And as you see, the red line is the fatality rate. And it's, it's never below 15% at any point in time. This is a story of a physician in Aden when COVID started in Aden. He said, and this actually won an award. He said, it's impossible for people in Yemen to be on lockdown. First of all, it's hot. There is no electricity. People cannot stay home. There are no services. And people just cannot stay home. They need to get out because if they stay home, that means they don't have anything to eat. We know through our work in Yemen, when we deliver food baskets to families, families tell us that it is better for them. They would rather die of COVID-19 than die of hunger because COVID-19 would be a faster death for them than to die of hunger. And this is what the doctor said. I think it's Yemen, Wuhan. Everyone is walking around with IV lines in their arms. There is water in the streets from the floods and sewage. The mosquitoes are the size of birds. It's a very infected city. It feels infected. It smells infected. It looks infected. This is what the Yemenis have to live through. This is a publication that says fear of hunger surpasses COVID-19 concerns for desperate Yemenis. So they did a survey in multiple places in Yemen, and that was the theme. We would rather die of COVID-19 than die of hunger. On top of all of this that's going on in Yemen, the international community is also reducing aid to Yemen. This is a reduction in humanitarian response due to cutting of funds. So aid agencies program cuts as of June 2020. In April, 31 of the 41 UN aid programs were cut or closed or reduced. Aid agencies reached only 9.5 million people in April compared to 15.6 million in December of 2019. Critical water and sanitation services stopped to 8.4 million people. In August, 19 million people will lose access to healthcare. So as you can see, with all that is going on in Yemen, we now have a cut in aid. 2.2 million people will lose access to urgent surgical assistance as well. So if we look at aid cuts, impact on people reached December 2019 to April 2020, you see the number of those who were targeted was 15.6 million. Now it's 9.5, and those who are reached from 12.8 to 8.7. This is an article that says, open your eyes. Yemen is on the brink of famine again, UN agencies are saying. However, that has not helped with increased funding. Joint international NGOs letter to USAID. USAID decided to suspend aid to northern part of Yemen. And in an open letter, 6 international agencies were asking that USAID lift a suspension of humanitarian assistance to northern Yemen. My issue with USAID when they suspend aid is they also apply pressure on other countries to also suspend aid to Yemen. And that's why we see a reduction in aid to Yemen. So what happened when USAID cut their aids? We had a sharp reduction in food aid. By September 2020, 9 million people lost access to health, and 250,000 severely malnourished children could die. These are displaced families suffer as aid shortfall closes clinics. a lot of the clinics that were dependent on international agencies actually had to close. And this is for internally displaced populations. So the closure of humanitarian health services affected a lot of healthcare workers. Also because since the moving the central bank from Sana'a in August of 2016, all the civil servants, especially in the northern parts of Yemen, were not receiving their salaries. They were receiving some stipends, incentives from international aid agencies. When that was cut, that also has affected a lot of places. and a lot of the healthcare workers now don't have substance for them to live. So by mid-August, 12 of 38 major programs closed or reduced services. And by the end of September, 20 more will close or scale down. In a displaced camp in Hajjah, tents that serve as health centers. These are some of the quotes of people who receive services. This is Fathia Jabir saying, "My son is sick, short of breath, want a working hospital because the clinic that they had was no longer providing services. Children are sick, pregnant women are sick. What did we do to deserve this?" This is Yahya Shamsan, also one of the internally displaced people. This is again October 18. This is from the UN Humanitarian head in Yemen. She said 15 of 41 major United Nations humanitarian programs in Yemen had already been reduced or shut their services, and 30 more will be affected in the coming weeks. She also said, nearly every humanitarian worker has had to tell a hungry family or someone who is still ill that they cannot help them because we don't have funding. So if we look at the summary of the humanitarian situation in Yemen, in 2020, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is still the worst in the world. 24 million people require assistance, high fatality rate of COVID-19 at 29%. Major UN programs are reducing or closing their programs. Yemen's economy is collapsing because of the moving of the bank and the blockade on the country and the destruction of the infrastructure. Yemen health system is on the verge of collapse. Malnutrition among women and young children in Yemen is the highest in the world, and we have multiple outbreaks. Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundations, we try to do as much as we can. We've done a lot of COVID-19 response. We were the first actually organization in all of Yemen to provide testing kits for COVID-19 that was donated to us from Berlin. We distribute food baskets, we do meat distribution, we are doing more income generation projects. We do orphan support, water filters, water tanks, assessment of flood and on people. And then we have a project that's funded by the Canadian to do water purifications system in 3 hospitals in Hodeidah. So why are we, this is something that a friend of mine and I wrote, and she actually, both of them now are board members in Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. We published it in December of 2015 and then updated it in 2017. We basically ask, why are we waging war on the people of Yemen? And when we say we mean the American administration. This October, on October 25, we put in an APHA policy that was passed, and we're very happy with that. And our policy statement calls to end the bombing of Yemen and to lifting the blockade. And we call on all healthcare workers to assist us in making this policy active. So what can we do as Americans, especially? We need to reach out to our representatives and express concern about the conflict in Yemen. We need to demand that they stop supporting the Saudi war on Yemen, pressure the Saudi to end the blockade, and use diplomacy for a political solution. We need to sign petitions, donate to any organization that you feel comfortable with, that is doing work in Yemen, the cutting of aid to many of the organizations is going to impact a lot of people. Yemen Relief is one of the organizations that is also collecting donations. And these were recommendations were in our original post at the Huffington Post in December 2015. And I hope that we do see a stop to the war on Yemen. And I'll stop here and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turan, for the informative presentation. And for now, we're going to be taking some questions. And the first three questions that I have, I'm going to start with the first one. It says, how can we advocate here for there to be a safe and easy way in regards to airplane services to travel to Yemen safe and sound? That's the first question.
So the reasons there is no direct flight to Yemen, and it's very challenging to travel in and out of Yemen, is actually the blockade. So one of the things that we can advocate for is ending the blockade on all seaports of Yemen. This is one thing that I talked to my representative, who is the chairperson in Congress for foreign relations. And one of the things I said, we need to end the blockade. If we are to end the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, we need to end the blockade. We need to allow the flow of goods to Yemen, people to go in freely and people to get out freely. When I traveled to Yemen, I went last summer, but not this summer. It took me 4 days to reach Yemen. I had to spend a night in Jordan. My flight was delayed for over 12 hours from Jordan to Aden. I reached Aden after midnight. I had spent another night in Aden, and then I had to take a car that took me over 16 hours to reach Sana'a. This is unacceptable. And we had to drive through so many checkpoints to get to the city where I needed to go. So if the blockade is lifted, it will ease people's economic situation in Yemen, but will also, people who need to travel for medical reasons, for medical evacuations, will be able to do that. And people like me and Qamar's grandmother can fly without having the hardship of getting to see our loved ones.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. The second question we have is, what was the main cause to the war in Yemen?
That's, there are many responses to that question, depending on who you talk to. I would actually refer to a German publication that said, and I would recommend that all of you and the reader and that someone who asked it to look at it as well. The German intelligence report in December of 2015 published a report saying that Mohammed bin Salman entered a war into Yemen because he thought that would make him a national hero in Saudi Arabia, and that therefore he would be the next king. Because at that point in time, it was his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, who was next in line to be king. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when this was allowed, and we have to remember that the war in Yemen was announced from Washington, D.C. It was not announced from Riyadh. So a lot of people thought it was going to be an easy war. Within 2 months, it will be over. And the Hadi government, who was forced out by the Houthis, was going to be reinstated. It's easy to determine when you can go into war, but it is very difficult to decide when that war is going to end. So we are in the 6th year. My belief, and I agree with the German intelligence report that was published in 2015, that Mohammed bin Salman thought that this is something that will make him a national hero and it was going to be an easy war in and out. That's what I think. And of course, I know there are many other, people believe there are many other reasons, but for me, that is the main reason.
Thank you. And the third question is, what's the best idea in ending the war in Yemen?
I think if the Yemenis have the chance to speak with one another, all the warring parties in Yemen, Right now, we have multiple parties to the war in Yemen. We have the Sana'a government that's led by the Houthis. We have the Southern Transitional Committee in Aden that's led by the separatists and controlled by and supported and controlled by the United Arab Emirates. We have the internationally recognized government that's been in Riyadh since the beginning of the war. So we have multiple parties that are Yemeni. And then we have other who are either regional or international players to it. I actually believe if the Yemenis sit together, they will be able to reach an agreement if the international players do not interfere and do not push them to make decisions. And again, this is my personal opinion. The Hadi government, the internationally recognized government, is in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, and President Hadi has not been able to go back to Yemen since he moved to Saudi Arabia. So I don't think, and again, this is my opinion, that the internationally recognized government has the power to make decisions that are independent of the Saudis as long as they are in Saudi Arabia. I think if the international community agrees to that, everybody who is, interfering in the Yemen conflict, again, regionally or internationally, let the Yemenis talk to each other, then they will find a way. There needs to be a unity government. And what I mean by unity government, I mean everybody who's part of the conflict is also part of the government. Yemen cannot be ruled by any one group. It's a tribal system, and tribal system usually works when you have a coalition from all the tribes, and they come together and work a deal where they can all, participate in the government. So I think if that's allowed, Yemen will be able to find a solution. And don't forget, Yemen has been in existence for thousands of years. They have a lot of culture and ways to resolve conflicts. And we need to allow that to happen. The Yemen war is not a sectarian war. People who try to paint it as a Sunni versus Shia is actually absolutely wrong, because within every household in Yemen, you have a brother who's supporting one side or the other of the conflict. So it's within each household. You have people who are either supporting one or the other of people fighting. So it is definitely not a sectarian war, although it is painted that way in the US, because if you paint it that way, then it means that it's very hard to find a solution to it. And people will say, oh, I cannot do anything about it. It's sectarian. It is definitely not a sectarian war.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. The last question we have is, why hasn't the US government stepped in to fix these horrific conditions?
Unfortunately, the US government is part of the problem, is not part of the solution. And that's why I think we as constituents to our representatives and our government, we need to make them hear our voices. The US government, whether it was under the Obama administration or under the Trump administration, are part of this conflict. Under the Obama administration, as I said, the war was announced from Washington, DC. The Obama administration needed the Saudi support for the Iran deal. And one way for them to get that, unfortunately, they sacrificed the Yemeni people by supporting the Saudi war in Yemen. And so that was part of how it started. And under this administration, the Trump administration doesn't really care. And he had said it very clearly in multiple ways. He said, as long as they are selling arms to Saudi Arabia, he does not care about the humanitarian aspect or human rights violations of the Yemeni people. And the fact that he also put Yemen on the ban list when the US is contributing to the humanitarian crisis just shows how this administration does not care about human rights and about people's lives, not just in Yemen. I actually think even in the US.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. We actually have one more question. They're saying, how can Yemen make peace with Saudi Arabia? Do you think that the US stopping to fund Saudi Arabia will give them a heads up and send a message that Yemen wants peace and wants to end the war?
Okay, I didn't hear it very clearly. Can you please read it again?
Yes, definitely. How can Yemen make peace with Saudi Arabia? Do you think that the US stopping to fund Saudi Arabia will give them a heads up and send a message that Yemen wants peace and wants to end the war?
So Yemen, it was not the aggressor. Well, Yemen was never the aggressor when it comes to the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has meddled in Yemen politics for many, many years. And so the Yemeni people don't have any problem except when the Saudis interfered in our business. So I'm not sure what else we can do to make them feel that we want peace. And yes, the US government can send a very clear message to the Saudis by stopping the support. If the US government stops support for the Saudi, the war will stop. They allowed it to go on, and they continue to allow it to go on. So it is, and that's why I think it's very important for us as individuals to pressure the US government. And that's why we have the APHA resolution. That's why we have advocacy around this issue. And I think the other thing also is there was a report in the National Interest last month that says that Saudi Arabia spent $100 million in recent years on public relations firms, on lobbying firms, to make sure that the US continue to support their war efforts in Yemen. So that's something that, they may have the funds to continue that, but our voices and the US government, whether it is the State Department or whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch, we have a much higher power over these institutions than lobbying funds that can come in. So yes, I think it is very important for us to continue to advocate for an end to the war and an end to the US support for the Saudi war on Yemen. The other thing the US government does is in international forums, when they, so for example, I'll give an example. When Holland requested independent investigation into war crimes in Yemen, it was the US and the UK that killed that initiative and didn't allow it to go forward. So the US government and the UK government, other than supporting them with logistics, with weapons, they also provide them cover in international forums. The Saudi were listed 3 times in the UN shame list for killing children, and 3 times were removed because of pressure on the UN to remove them from the list. So it's the US government has, and the UK government are active players. And without them, this war would not continue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaman. Those are the last questions we had for today. If you have more, please feel free to email us. Thank you again to our speaker, Dr. Aisha Jaman, for taking the time to be here and to talk to us today. We will finish off this webinar by having another presentation by Sarah and by providing you with resources to help resolve yourself and others.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Dr. Jaman, again for such an informative webinar. Someone being Yemeni myself, that was extremely heartfelt. And our next speaker is Sarah Al-Zu'bi, and she is a second-year Harvard Medical School student. She has won the Harry Truman Scholarship in 2018 while attending Miami University, and she has graduated as summa cum laude with her BS in Human Capital Management and Leadership with a French minor. As an immigrant to the United States from Jordan, she has worked extensively with the Arab refugees in Cincinnati and across Ohio to increase the self-sufficiency in their adopted homes and improve their knowledge about and access to healthcare and medical health resources. This work has led her to start her own nonprofit, the Three Sisters Foundation, which is currently working on a Yemen healthcare initiative to shed light on the health humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Sarah and her team are passionate about increasing awareness of the crisis in the larger global health community through co-sponsoring of COVID-19 in Yemen Symposium, the National Healthcare Toolkit, and their petition. She's also the former US Ambassador for Humanitarian Affairs to the United Nations. She's joining us today to shed some light on some ongoing projects that she's currently working on with her team to help support Yemen, And I would like to thank Sarah for all the work she has done and for taking the time to speak with us today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sara, like Gama already mentioned. I started Three Sisters way back in 2018. I was still in college, and we were working on trying to create more spaces for supporting health literacy and empowering women, especially in the Middle East, through health literacy and advocacy. And we felt that by increasing access to information, we would empower a lot more decision making across the country when it comes to healthcare. And a lot of our projects were really focused around that. And we focused essentially on trying to figure out ways to increase health literacy in general with non-communicable diseases and communicable diseases, even though the communicable diseases get covered very well by many governmental institutions. We wanted to kind of think about like how are non-communicable diseases being managed and what are ways we can support refugee women who tend to be a lot of the who tend to take care more of the current, like of the home and have a better understanding of the health information of their families. And so that's kind of the projects that we worked on. We worked with U.S. Committee for Refugee and Immigrants on projects and different ones across the country. But we kind of went on to think about other ways that we can really bring more awareness to the Middle East and crises that are happening. And while the Yemeni crisis is not, quote unquote, a refugee crisis because of the current situation, we really felt that the current advocacy, and I think in the general sense of what's happening in the Middle East, that Yemen doesn't really get a lot of attention. And as Dr. Jaman already mentioned, a lot of that has to do with the PR campaigns that are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars that Yemenis don't have the money to spend on to share their story. And so that, along with the fact that, having worked through organizations that, and the UN, thinking about how those funds work and how we think about funding and how so much of that is really tied back to, we are going to give you X amount of dollars, but that requires us an XYZ PR campaign. And the problem with that is that you have a one-sided story that really takes over, what quote unquote the UN continuously calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So really it came to a point where it was like, I think everybody knows the byline of like Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but what are we doing about it? And where is the rest of the story? And to be frank, to be honest, I think that story is missing. And so we kind of took on the Yemen healthcare advocacy part of things, because I think even within the global health community, there's a huge lack in thinking about the Yemeni crisis at all. And I think that's kind of, I think it's indicative of how much these PR campaigns have worked. And I think it's also indicative of just the overall angle and direction that the global health community tends to take. And so we took on the Yemen healthcare advocacy campaign that's continued on, in early June. And it splits into three parts. Our first part is we're working on an advocacy effort. And the first component of that is we are partnering with the University of California at San Francisco Refugee and Asylee Health Initiative conference that usually happens once a year. It's focused on refugee health. But I think that there's the Yemeni crisis is just so special in the sense that, it's not refugees, it's IDPs, but that means that we need to even put in more effort to bring that to light. And so the keynote for that symposium, we managed to get to be focused on Yemen. And I think it's COVID-19 in Yemen. But I think, as you've heard from Dr. Jaman, who, I've worked with and have the honor of working with consistently, is that there are many infectious diseases that we're seeing in Yemen. And really the goal is to kind of shed light and bring that to the attention of the global health community, because we're seeing diseases that, the infectious disease community in the general sense isn't necessarily focused on because of, the incidence and prevalence. But what we're realizing is that also needs to be talked about. And so that's part of our work, was like coordinating and figuring out how do we bring the right people to talk about the current COVID situation in COVID-19, and how do we bring Yemeni voices to that? And I think that's a problem that is ubiquitous in global health, but even more in the Yemeni crisis of, Yemen has an amazing history. It's had many civilizations. It has some of the greatest minds in the Middle East. But I think most of the time, the people that are talking about Yemen don't tend to be Yemenis. And so I think that the goal of that was to really bring forward Yemeni, Dr. Jaman is obviously on the panel, but also other Yemenis to kind of shed light on the situation and bring a firsthand story. So that's the first part of what we're working on. And then the second part, which is almost near the end, has been a national healthcare toolkit that we're hoping to distribute across medical institutions in the United States, trying to get the global health community up to speed. What we're realizing is the situation is so multifaceted, and I think it shows to a great extent that healthcare is dependent on all these other social determinants. And I think Yemen is the biggest example of that when we're looking at whether it's food insecurity or water sanitation or the economy, or thinking about how poor access and not having poor access really impacts the overall health of the community. And so I think that that's also been a huge part of trying to create a more concise, stable source with somewhat of accurate information, which has been a true struggle with the Yemeni crisis. And I think that's in continuum of what I shared earlier about having the PR requirements with donations is also the data, right? The data is being altered in ways that is also very concerning and really perpetuates a lot of the issues that we're having with with even sharing the Yemeni side of the story. And so that's kind of our next project. And we're aligning that with a petition that we're trying to figure out the actual audience for it, but it's going to be targeted towards healthcare professionals and trying to really bring forth some of those pertinent facts and get, I think the healthcare community in the United States has a lot of power when it comes to a global health issue that's really, it's been labeled as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but frankly, I don't think people understand what that actually means and the extent of what it means. And it's one of those things as you learn more, and I really encourage you to just, once the toolkit is out, or just to Google and realize the extent of this crisis and just what future generations are going to say about how we were complicit in watching this go down. And so that's kind of the second part, is figuring out how do we plan for this petition and toolkit to be sort of planned together and to create an action step for people and realize okay, these are organizations I could be donating to, and this is ways for me to get more information. So that's kind of the first arm of our advocacy efforts. And we're hoping to do a more health-focused social media campaign. So if anyone is interested in doing something like that, reach out to me. I think Gomad has all my information, so just email me. And so that's kind of the first part. The second part has been more of a researching the ventilator situation, which I know Dr. Jamal and I have talked about extensively, in the sense that we want to make sure that the ventilators that are being used in Yemen that are open source are safe. And when we're thinking about that, making sure that they've gone through the proper research protocol to make sure that they can be used on Yemenis on the ground. And that's actually been a pretty difficult part of our project. We've had different calls with different teams in Yemen, but just thinking about how we get parts, and getting parts is impossible, and figuring out, the teams are trying to figure out how do we balance of the shortage in supplies, and then how do we also do this in a way that's still safe. And so, to be frank, a lot of the teams are combining different open source models and creating their own. So that kind of raises a lot of those questions about the ethics of that and making sure that it's safe. So we're trying to figure out a way to create a mentorship program of a broad-based medical equipment engineers that speak Arabic to work with some of these teams to think about some of the ways that they're working with it and how to make it more safe, because that's the utmost priority. We want to make sure that that's, the ventilators are being properly used, which is really hard because it's continuously changing. And, now that we're on the verge of possibly another COVID surge, thinking about what that actually means. And then finally, the third part is a public health video that we're working on. We have a script ready and we have a acting team ready. We're just finalizing some of the other parts of the project, but we're trying to think about ways, really continuing that theme of we want this to be focused on Yemen. So we want Yemenis to talk about ways to protect themselves from COVID-19 in the Yemeni way. And so we have a couple of Yemenis on our team, and we've been just trying to think of ways to make it more approachable and just trying to understand the context of COVID-19, what it means in Yemen, and then trying to figure out a way to make it more approachable and easy on the local population to take that into account. So those are kind of that's like the 3 parts of our project. They're at different levels of the finalization / not. And so that's kind of, I think in the end, right, it's like the goal is to have more people care. And I think that's the problem, is like you have, kind of like what Dr. Jamal is talking about. It's like you need to have awareness. You need to have people to sign petitions, to care enough to sign petitions. We need to have people talking to, we're constituents, and we do have a lot of power. And so figuring out ways to get the community to know about it, to be able to converse and talk, as constituents. And so I think that, it's trying to come at it from all the different angles, and we try to come in from a healthcare perspective. And that's kind of, some of the things that we've been working on. If anybody has any ideas or want to join any of the efforts, definitely feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Sarah, with all of those wonderful projects going. And next, what we'll go ahead and do is have Roxana share the infographics and a couple of resources that we have provided to shed light on what is going on in Yemen. So Roxana, go ahead and take the floor for that.
Okay, thank you so much to both of the speakers. So Health Education has created a few infographics, and in order to gain more information on the resources we have, you can find them on our website, www.shifaclinic.org, under our webinars tab.
Thank you, Roxana. I would like to thank our audience for joining us today in our webinar, as well as thank our wonderful guest speakers again for taking the time to assist us in spreading this information. I hope you will all tune in to our next webinars in December. And please visit our website to gain more information on the infographics that we have created. We have a plethora of them, starting from the starvation in Yemen to COVID to cholera to women's health. So I hope you all have a wonderful week and tune into our next webinars. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.